Hello and welcome to 10 Minutes On, the podcast where I take a look at what's happening in the world and try to get behind the headlines of a particular story that is making the news. I'm Guy Burton, a researcher and scholar. Over the years, I've taught and conducted research at universities around the world, and in this podcast, I try to apply that training to help make sense of current events as quickly and as clearly as possible. I always welcome feedback and comments, whether about individual episodes or the podcast more generally. I'm especially interested in hearing what listeners liked, what they didn't like, and what topics they think deserve attention in future episodes. If there's an event coming up and you think would make a good subject, do get in touch. You can reach me through the various social media platforms I use, including Blue Sky and LinkedIn, or via my website at www.guyburton.net. And if you would like to help the podcast grow, there are a few simple ways to do that. Leaving a review or rating on whichever podcast platform you use helps others discover the show. You can also subscribe so that new episodes appear automatically each Tuesday morning when they are released. And of course, sharing the podcast with friends, family, or colleagues who might find it interesting is always appreciated. So with that out of the way, let's turn to this week's topic. Today's episode focuses on supply chain choke points, narrow maritime passages through which enormous volumes of global trade must pass. In particular, I want to look at 4 waterways that play an outsized role in the global economy: the Strait of Hormuz, the Suez Canal and the Red Sea down to the Strait of Bab al-Mandab, the Strait of Malacca and the Panama Canal. According to a recent report from Boston Consulting Group, taken together, these routes carry more than half of global trade between the world's major economic centers in Europe, Asia and North America. One of these choke points, the Strait of Hormuz, has been in the news this week. But rather than focusing only on that one location, it's worth using the moment to examine the others as well, because each of them presents its own vulnerabilities. If any one of them were to close or become severely disrupted, the consequences for the global economy would be considerable. So let's start with the Strait of Hormuz. The reason it has received so much attention recently is the continuing and escalating conflict involving the United States, Israel and Iran. On 28th of February, US President Donald Trump authorized strikes alongside Israel against Iranian targets. The expectation in Washington appeared to be that the attacks would stun Iran, perhaps even decapitate its leadership, and bring the confrontation to a rapid end. That assumption has proved optimistic at best. Iran's regime has shown itself to be more resilient than anticipated and has responded by widening the conflict. One of its most consequential moves has been to close the Strait of Hormuz. There have been a number of attacks on shipping. 2 tankers were hit earlier in the northern Gulf near Iraqi ports. Then last Wednesday, a Thai-flagged vessel attempting to transit the strait was struck. The following day, on Thursday, Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, confirmed in his first public address that Iran would continue blocking the strait. In practice, closing the strait has not required a large number of attacks. The threat alone has been enough to deter most shipping companies. The strait itself is about 59 kilometers wide, but the navigable shipping lanes are only around 3.7 kilometers across. That makes it relatively easy to disrupt traffic. The effect has been dramatic. In normal circumstances, around 20 million barrels of oil pass through the strait each day, representing roughly a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade. According to the UK Maritime Trade Operations Centre and the maritime intelligence firm Vanguard, daily transits since the conflict escalated have dropped sharply. Whereas around 140 vessels would typically pass through each day, the figure recently has been closer to 5. Oil markets have reacted quickly. Prices rose from around $65 per barrel on 26th of February to more than $100 2 weeks later, after US strikes on military targets on Kharg Island over the weekend. The political response in Washington has been somewhat contradictory. President Trump has at times suggested that higher oil prices could benefit the United States, or at least its oil industry. But that overlooks the impact on consumers. Since the start of the conflict, diesel prices in the United States have risen by roughly 25%, while in Europe they have increased by about 20%. At the same time, there appears to be an awareness in the White House that the situation carries risks domestically. The administration has appealed to allies and partners to support efforts to reopen the strait, including from the United Kingdom, France, Japan and South Korea, and even China. The response so far has been cautious. China has largely remained silent. Japan has pointed to the political and legal difficulties of sending warships. South Korea has been in discussions with Washington, but has not committed to direct involvement. Meanwhile, the UK and France, like China, have suggested that the most effective solution would be de-escalation of the conflict itself. That has not gone down particularly well in Washington. President Trump has criticized NATO allies and warned that the alliance could face consequences if they do not support US efforts. The stakes are high because the Strait of Hormuz is not only important for oil, it is also a crucial route for natural gas exports, particularly liquefied natural gas from Qatar and the UAE. Together, they account for roughly 20% of global LNG exports. According to the International Energy Agency, several Gulf producers are especially dependent on the strait. Countries such as Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain rely almost entirely on it for their exports. Saudi Arabia and the UAE do have alternative routes. Saudi oil can be transported across the Arabian Peninsula to ports on the Red Sea, while the UAE has a pipeline to the port of Fujairah outside the strait. But those alternatives have limited capacity. They reduce the amount of oil that can bypass the strait by roughly 80%, allowing only around 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day to be transported. The markets most exposed to disruption are in Asia. More than 80% of the oil that passes through the Strait of Hormuz ultimately goes to Asian economies. Roughly 800,000 barrels per day go to China, around 700,000 to India, and another 2.1 million barrels to other Asian markets. For the moment, however, there may be some buffer. China is believed to maintain the world's largest emergency oil reserves, estimated at around 1.3 billion barrels, which could sustain supply for several months. The United States has the second largest strategic reserves, around 854 million barrels in state and private holdings, which could provide roughly 40 days of supply. India has also been granted a waiver by the United States to purchase additional Russian oil as an alternative. But the Strait of Hormuz is only one of several vulnerable points in the global trading system. Alongside Hormuz, 3 other choke points carry more than 50% of world trade. They include the Suez Canal and the nearby Bab al-Mandab Strait, linking the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, the Strait of Malacca between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, and the Panama Canal connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The Suez Canal and the Bab al-Mandab Strait have already experienced significant disruption in recent years. Following the outbreak of the Israel-Hamas war in late 2023, Houthi rebels in Yemen began targeting commercial shipping in the Red Sea. Historically, piracy had been the main maritime security problem in this region, particularly from the African side of the strait via the Somali coast during the 2000s and early 2010s. But the Houthis introduced a new form of threat. Less than a month after Israel began its bombing campaign in Gaza, the Houthis launched attacks on shipping in the Red Sea from the other side of the strait in Yemen, using drones, missiles, and both manned and unmanned boats. Their stated aim was to pressure Israel and its Western partners. The effect on global trade was immediate. In 2023, the Red Sea and Suez Canal accounted for around 12% of global maritime trade. But as attacks increased, shipping companies began avoiding the route. Traffic declined sharply. By 2024, the number of containers passing through this canal had fallen by around 90%, with many ships rerouted around the southern tip of Africa. That detour significantly increases travel time. Shipping between Asia and Europe via the Cape of Good Hope can take 40 to 50 days, which is between 9 and 17 days longer than the traditional Suez route. It also raises fuel and crew costs. As a result, shipping rates between Shanghai and Rotterdam rose by around 80% compared with the start of the war. Even after a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas in October 2025, normal shipping through the region has not fully recovered. For now, the Houthis have not indicated that they intend to close the Red Sea in response to the current conflict involving Iran. But if they were to do so, it would also affect Saudi Arabia's main alternative export route, the one that carries oil across the peninsula to Red Sea ports. Further east lies another critical choke point, the Strait of Malacca. This narrow passage between the Malay Peninsula and the Indonesian island of Sumatra links the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea. It is arguably the most important shipping route in Asia. In fact, more oil passes through the Strait of Malacca than through Hormuz, around 23 million barrels per day, or roughly 30% of global oil trade. The threats here are somewhat different. There are occasional tensions between Malaysia and Indonesia over maritime borders, but the two countries have generally cooperated in policing the strait through joint sea and air patrols. The more persistent problem has been piracy and armed robbery at sea. Attacks declined sharply after coordinated security efforts in the mid-2010s, falling from around 100 incidents in 2015. But in recent years, they have been creeping back up again, reaching roughly 60 reported cases by 2023. Many analysts link this increase to underlying economic conditions in part of the region. Poverty, underdevelopment, and unemployment make illicit activities such as piracy a tempting alternative source of income for some local communities. But beyond piracy, there is a broader strategic concern known as the Malacca dilemma. This is particularly relevant for China. Around two-thirds of China's trade passes through the Strait of Malacca, including around 80% of its oil imports. In theory, that creates a major vulnerability if a rival power, such as the United States or India, were ever able to blockade the strait during a crisis. China has attempted to mitigate this risk in several ways. It has invested in access to civilian ports across the Indian Ocean region, some of which can potentially support naval operations. It has also developed alternative infrastructure routes, including pipelines and transport corridors linking Western China to ports in Myanmar and Pakistan. Many of these projects form part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. But these alternatives are far from foolproof. Overland routes pass through politically unstable regions, including areas affected by insurgency or conflict. The military takeover in Myanmar and the ongoing civil war there, as well as instability in parts of Pakistan, illustrate how fragile some of these alternatives may be. Finally, there is the Panama Canal. Compared with the other choke points, the Panama Canal handles a smallest share of global trade, around 5%, but it is still strategically important, particularly for trade between the United States and Asia. Nearly half of the trade moving from the US East Coast to Asia passes through the canal. The main threat here is not political conflict, but environmental pressure. The canal relies heavily on fresh water from nearby reservoirs, particularly Lake Gatun, to operate its system of locks. Periodic droughts linked to the El Niño climate phenomenon can lower water levels and restrict how many ships can pass through. This became particularly evident in 2023, when drought conditions forced the Panama Canal Authority to reduce daily transits and impose limits on the weight of vessels. At one point in August of that year, there were around 150 ships waiting to pass through, with delays of up to 21 days. These delays increase operating costs and disrupt supply chains as ships burn additional fuel while waiting and cargo deliveries arrive later than planned. The canal's authorities have not been idle in response. They have modified booking systems, begun constructing alternative additional reservoirs, and explored ways to capture and recycle water used in the locks. Traffic through the canal has since begun to recover, but climate change means that El Niño events are becoming more frequent and more intense, suggesting that water shortages could remain a recurring challenge for the canal in the long term. And that brings us back to the bigger picture. Global trade often appears abstract, a vast network of container ships, energy flows, and supply chains linking economies together. But in reality, much of it depends on a handful of very specific physical routes. The Strait of Hormuz, the Suez Canal and the Bab al-Mandab, the Strait of Malacca, and the Panama Canal among the most important of these. Together they form the narrow arteries through which a large share of the global economy moves. When they function normally, they are easy to overlook, but when even one of them becomes disrupted, whether through conflict, piracy, or environmental pressure, the effects ripple quickly through energy markets, shipping routes, and ultimately consumer prices. That's where I'll leave things for this episode. Hopefully this has provided a useful overview of some of the major maritime choke points that underpin global trade and why they matter so much for economies in Asia, Europe, and the Americas. Thank you for listening. As always, if you found the episode interesting, I'd be grateful if you would leave a rating or review on your podcast platform of choice, share the episode with others who might enjoy it, or get in touch with feedback and suggestions for future topics. I'll be back again next Wednesday with another episode of 10 Minutes On. So until next Tuesday, thank you for listening and goodbye.